Welcome again to the Dodcast. I'm Luke Dodson and I'm joined by Greg Moffitt, broadcaster, journalist and host of the Legalise Freedom Podcast. So, Greg, thanks for coming on the podcast. I've been following yours for a couple of years now. I discovered it through our mutual contact, Jasun Horsley, and also I've noticed that we've got sort of shared connections with James Howard Kunstler, Anthony Peake, and people like that. John Michael Greer as well, who I'll be talking to tomorrow. So for those who are unfamiliar, would you like to give a little bit of background as to where you came from and how you got to be where you are today and your interests?
Well, the podcast I launched back in 2012, I actually set it up in 2011, but originally the idea was it was going to be a blog. And there were so many things I've been interested in. I mean, it's easier, rather than me giving you an extensive list, it's easier for people to just have a quick look at legalisefreedom.com and even just look at the site tags to see what topics there are. But these are things I've been interested in beginning right back when I was a teenager, going back to the early 80s. And it's just a rolling interest throughout my life. But I got to a certain point where 9/11 was certainly a pivotal event, but I got to a certain point where I thought, these concerns that I have can no longer be, these interests can no longer just be a hobby. I've always cared deeply about the fate of humanity. And I thought, this is something I now need to start working on. And around about 2010, my girlfriend at the time, I was spending increasing amounts of time in her workshop where she did her crafts, and I'd be upstairs in my study reading about all these various topics of interest and import. And I'd come down and say, oh, wow, have you heard about this? What do you think about this? And at some point she said, do you know what? This is like really interesting. And I like hearing about it, but shouldn't you be sharing this with other people? So that's where the idea of a blog came from. And even though I've been a writer since the late 80s, mostly about music, but these days more about culture in general, I started to blog off and realized quite quickly that reading long form articles is not my preferred way of hearing about new topics. What I like to do is just listen to people having a conversation. So that's when I flipped it over to become a podcast, which is the first episodes went out in spring of 2012.
Quite a symbolically charged year that was, 2012, and a year that a lot of changes seemed to happen in the world. I remember that was the year that the Savile inquiry thing broke out, and it really felt like that some sort of massive revelation was about to take place concerning the British establishment and maybe the world establishment as well. And that was around the time that I'd always been interested in sort of conspiracies and things like this, but the sort of tangible, visceral reality sort of kicked in, as I suppose it also did for many of us after 9/11.
Well, absolutely, yeah. There's and these revelations have been, we mentioned Savile, these things have been gathering apace, and Harvey Weinstein, and that these things continue to emerge, and I feel that it's part of a growing, how can I put it? I don't want to use the word awakening because it just sounds all new agey, and that all that stuff around 2012 as well, which I never bought into. It sounds too much like that. But as we, as a species, come under more pressure, physically, psychologically, on every front, then these sort of dawning realizations are increasing at pace. Basically, that the world is, and reality is, not everything that it seems to be. essentially, and that covers a great deal of different insights and information, again, which is what I'm working on and you are as well, and a lot of our guests and mutual contacts are working on as well. That there's a lot more going on here than meets the five senses, and the idea that we have apparently human beings on Earth that will plumb to these depths of depravity. There was a time, I certainly remember growing up in the 1970s, Jimmy Savile. I mean, I always questioned what the actual fuck is this guy's talent. I couldn't understand why someone so ugly and apparently not, let's not base our judgment people on their looks, but the media operates in that way. How someone so twisted and so apparently untalented could be a media icon. So we've moved a long way from that unquestioning worship of these people, media, politicians, other people in public life, royal families. Look at the war. Look at the impacts on the British royal family there's been in the last few years. Look at how their status has changed so much in the last few decades. So we're in a phase now, increasingly so, where all of these, a lot of assumptions are being called into question, and that's difficult for some people. They don't want to face it, but I think it's a necessary part of the transitionary phase that we're in at the moment.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you compare the 70s to now, that in one way, people are a large segment of the population is far less questioning of reality than they were back then. Some people have raised the possibility that this sort of COVID hysteria wouldn't have really flown in the 1970s. It just wouldn't have gone anywhere, where people now in a state of kind of constant disembodiment and disassociation, and through sort of priming from Hollywood movies and video games, and also kind of the use of virtue signaling and moral kind of outrage has made it possible to convince many people of a narrative that just doesn't bear out with most people's lived experience, or even the official statistics that are given, as you covered in your last podcast, I think, with the doctor, the Swedish doctor who his name escapes me right now, but had laid out very clearly the statistical anomalies in the whole narrative. But on the other hand, as you say, back then also you had Savile and the royal family getting up to all kinds of unbelievable shenanigans. Well, certain members of the royal family, most likely. I'll be careful about what I say, but most likely getting up to all kinds of shenanigans that are obscene beyond our wildest imaginations. Sometimes in plain sight on TV. And unquestioned, seemingly unquestioned, although, yeah, as you say, I remember seeing people like Jimmy Savile and Jonathan King on children's TV when I was growing up in the 1990s, and having the same question of why are these gross old weirdos on kids' TV? Like, what have they done? So what I'm driving at is it's an interesting sort of paradox in that it feels as though people are more brainwashed than ever, but then more people are kind of breaking their brainwashing than ever before at the same time. Would you say that sort of gels with your experience?
Yeah, there are two excuse me, apparently contradictory things happening here, as you say. I pointed out about this obedience in the 70s to mainstream and media and celebrity figures. But you're right to point out about the it's definitely a valid point that the COVID narrative may not have flown, to use your word, in the 1970s as well. There would have been a certain portion of the public, I think of my father and my grandfather and the sort of men that they were, they're just going, fuck off. What are you talking about? You know, are you kidding me? You know, which is what I feel is like, wow, really? You expect me to buy this crap? You know, how stupid do you think I am? So yeah, there's these, and the apparently contradictory trends are in place now as well. As we say, you know, people sinking deeper into unconsciousness, and a certain segment of the population being aroused or awoken to some new insights through this. And I used the term many, many times in interviews, a bifurcation. You know, basically, I can see the human species basically splitting into two. It's almost like the Eloi and the Morlocks in H.G. Wells' Time Machine. You know, some people becoming more base and sinking into unconsciousness and denial, and other people, you know, awakening to something, a realization, as I mentioned before, that reality is not all that it appears. For the 5 sense reality, there's a much wider existence out there, and they're slowly becoming aware of that and what that means.
This is something that occurred to me as I was reading your article for New Dawn magazine about the John Michael Creel's term, the long descent, which you contrasted. You get quite a nice duality between the long descent and the Great Reset. And the Great Reset is sort of this attempt by the technocratic overlords to ward off the long descent in some way, like King Canute sort of trying to order the sea, although actually he was making a point about that, which people often miss. But anyway, that sort of idea of the the emperors trying to achieve immortality by taking Mercury, but ultimately the inevitability of the long descent will override all of that, and I think this is the view I take as well. I think it's something that is worth reminding our friends in the sort of conspiracy community, who can let their fears get a little bit ahead of themselves, I think, in terms of the kind of omnipotent, the assumed omnipotence of the people behind these kinds of schemes, which I do think that there is, that there are, obviously, as we all know, there are conspiratorial schemes, and some of them are extremely sophisticated and subtle and very effective, but ultimately, flying in the face of certain laws of physical reality and maybe spiritual reality as well. So yeah, I like that. That duality that you pose in the article there.
Well, with regard to the response to the pandemic, I'm still trying to figure out what's really going on, because this is clearly not just about, as John Waters put it, head cold. John Waters being the Irish journalist who's a recent guest on my show, one of the best shows I've ever done. It was epic. So if viewers haven't listened to it, please check it out. And another regular guest of mine, another Irishman as well, Thomas Sheridan, he has repeatedly said, look, if they wanted this Great Reset agenda, and all the things that are attached to that, and by the way, I've made 19 videos on the pandemic response related to the Great Reset, what might be happening. Those are all available on the YouTube channel, Legalise Freedom 1. And I still don't fully understand it, but Thomas has said, look, they could have the Great Reset tomorrow morning if they wanted. They could have the cashless society tomorrow morning. They could just do it. universal basic income, social credit scheme along the lines of what China has. They could just implement all this. And as much as I agree with him on that, I still think that it's easier to implement these huge social changes with the background of the pandemic and the response to that, because it's a way of saying these changes are coming in. You can't argue with them because pandemic, because virus. Whereas if there was nothing much going on, it was just business as usual, like, well, hang on a minute, you want to abolish cash? You want to, because of increasing automation, you're going to tell people just you got no jobs anymore, just stay at home and play computer games, and we'll put £1,000 every month into your bank account. But be careful to obey the rules, otherwise we won't put the money in your account. I just think it's easier to do it potentially if you have this, as I say, this background of this a crisis situation. It's like everything, like what did what did Hitler do when he wanted to bump Germany into a war footing? Reichstag fire. What happened in America? And it doesn't matter what you think about the reasons behind 9/11. The point was that even if the official narrative is completely bang on the money, completely true, it was still used as a justification for a lot of other things. So I agree with Thomas. They could do it without that, and it also bears repeating that I'm still not completely sure what's going on. I've thought a lot about this, and I've done a lot of work on this since the start of the pandemic, and I still can't come down and tell you that that I've got a complete fully formed opinion on what's going on here. It remains to be seen. Thomas and I have both made videos on the possibility that there's some kind of existential threat to the Earth and the human species that may be powering this response. When I say that, I'm talking about solar flares, comet impacts, asteroid strikes, something from off planet. And that might sound way out there, but really in the journey I've been on trying to figure out what the hell's going on, that's one place I've been, in terms of like, could this be possible?
Well, it would be quite a literal curveball from outer space. But the one that seems to me, from what you're saying, that hypothetically the elites could be aware of some sort of astrophysical phenomena. Is that right?
Yeah, and John Waters said it in my interview with him. He's the same as so many of us trying to figure this out. Do they know something we don't? Do they know something we don't? Because that would begin to make sense of this. Just something that information we're not privy to. And that could be, well, who knows?
Well, this is really interesting to get that expanded sense of possibility about what this could be about, because as you say, it's so weird. The situation is so strange. I mean, it makes 9/11 look pretty sort of straightforward. I mean, there's a lot going on with 9/11, but ultimately, you sort of you look at the situation in the Middle East, that sort of thing, Project for a New American Century, and yeah, it's, you can go deep into the connections between Al Qaeda and the CIA, or indeed, I mean, more than connections, in fact, sort of precise overlaps in a lot of cases. But with this situation, something else is going on that's very strange. And Greer's Dreamwidth blog, a lot of people are pointing out the possibility of demonic influence of some form, of influence from other planes of existence. So for those who are open to that possibility as well, there's this. But coming back to this, the possibility of an asteroid, do you think that it's a way of kind of keeping people occupied and getting people used to massive crises of sort of energy crises and shortages and supply chain difficulties, because there's some sort of looming natural phenomenon that would cause those on a huge scale?
Possibly. Now, Thomas Sheridan addressed this in one of his videos in the last few days, in terms of what effect a threat from space might have on the Earth, in terms of like just complete disaster, all life on Earth, if not extinguished, then brought to a very low level that it has been in the past. And there was a huge volcanic eruption in the Indian subcontinent. I can't remember how many thousand years ago, but it's posited that reduced the human population to a few thousand, so that we're all extended from that small group. So if something like that's happened in the past, it can certainly happen again. And we know that human mythology is replete with stories from Atlantis to Lemuria to Mu about high civilizations in high antiquity that were wiped out. Every culture in the world has global deluge stories, a flood, the land being overwhelmed by water and almost all life being extinguished. So I think this is entirely feasible in terms of like something that could happen again. And it would be, I suppose, if you're thinking in the part of like globalists and controllers, to prep people in some way to modify their behavior, modify their expectations. And you mentioned also resource limits in terms of fossil fuels, for example, and what we can expect in the future, energy, and what a challenge that is to the civilization that we currently have. And those things they may appear separate, but they may well not be. It's entirely possible you could have the agenda for prepping people for an existential threat, and also for reduced, how can I put it, reduced expectations, reduced lifestyle, doing with less. That's entirely a thing, and it's really interesting. What Greer, you refer to John Michael Greer. I recommend his writings and his work to everyone. It's so interesting across so many areas. The purely material and 5 sense reality that we're dealing with day to day that he writes about, and he writes about the esoteric and about magic as well. And for me, that's what that's why he's one of my favorite guests to have on the show. He just covers so many bases, and it's really interesting to think about there being some kind of spiritually malevolent influence in what's happening in the world right now. And this is something I've looked into, actually. I've relatively recently become interested in the works of Rudolf Steiner, the anthroposophist. Just Google him if people don't know who he is. You'll find all sorts of interesting information. And I've had a few guests on to talk about the world and reality and current events against that background, as a way to try to understand what might be happening. This just doesn't make sense. So what lens can we look at things through that might help us? And that's been one of them. And actually, one of the interviews I did was with Jasun Horsley, entitled, "What if some people out there in the world are not like us?" The idea being that the human being that I am and that you are, there may be other types of beings that appear to be the same as us, but they're not. And their motivations may be very different. And they could be way down on some kind of scale of consciousness, and motivation, or they could be in another level altogether that we cannot yet fully grasp.
Yes, I listened to that conversation. It's fascinating. It comes back to another idea that was floated on Greer's Dreamwidth blog, which is that if we take the model of reincarnation, then the population of larger land animals has gone drastically down in the past few centuries, whereas the population of humans has gone drastically upwards. So what you have is basically all of these larger sort of land mammals and land animals like tigers and bison and lions and elephants and crocodiles and all the rest of it, who suddenly find themselves in these human bodies. They're born into these human bodies now, and they don't really know what being a human is about. And so they're just kind of wandering around a little bit bewildered and kind of go, all right, okay, well, I suppose, yeah, well, there's a pandemic on, so we all have to do these things now, don't we? And there's a small number of people who've probably been through the human thing a few times who are kind of going, hang on a minute, this isn't what being a human is about. That's quite what that really means in terms of the truth of that, I don't know, but it's at the very least, it's an interesting metaphor to play around with, and I suspect there may well be some truth to it as well.
Sorry if I excuse me, if I missed the first part of what you were saying. Did you say that Greer wrote about this?
He's mentioned it as an idea on his Dreamwidth blog. I believe it was his idea, but or at the very least some commenters. I think it was from him. Yeah, and it's a fascinating idea.
Oh, it really is. The Dreamwidth thing I was only recently made aware of, actually, because when he moved from the Arts Druid Report, which was his blog for many years, across to Ecosophia, which is his current blog, I thought that was basically it. I wasn't aware of the Dreamwidth thing until the last interview I did with him that he posted about on there saying, "Oh, new interview," So I wasn't aware of it until then. But that's a really interesting idea. I'm not trying to say anything aggrandizing about myself, but I can't remember when it was like about 5 or 6 years ago, a past life hypnosis regression session. And it became clear to me during that I've been a human time after time after time. And at the end of it, I remember coming out of it, saying to myself, this is before any of the current bullshit unfolded. I'm ready to stop incarnating as a human. Not for a very positive reason. I said I'm tired. I'm absolutely exhausted by this experience, and I tend to be a very positive person. But that's how I felt after that session. I was taken back through centuries of lives in detail that I couldn't possibly just have, because basically the lady who was doing the hypnosis was asking me, she was talking me through this experience, and I have a recording of it, and there's no way I could have made all that up on the spot. It would have been an act of incredible creativity to just come out with these lifetimes just without any prompting at all. So what happened here, what happened there, then what happened, who were these people, what, and it was all just I saw it like just images in front of me. So it was like, say for example, you were watching a movie, and like right now, but I couldn't see the screen in your room there, but you were describing it to me. You would just be going on, here's what's happening, and oh, there's a guy just come in and this is happening, and oh, there's, this is happening and this is happening. Imagine there was no movie, no screen in front of you, and I said, tell me a story. You'd be like, oh, okay. You see how that would feel. So that's why I felt that there was something to it. because it was these rolling series of images in my mind's eye, and I just described them. I said that I did this, and I was 30 years old when my daughter was born, and I died when I was 60, and I died at home with my wife and my daughter by my bedside, and we lived next to the sea, and we earned a lot of, we earned a lot of our keep through fishing, and it was very, very cold in the winter. I think I was in Scandinavia, and the grass, I remember from living by the coast when I was a child, that really hard grass that you get grows in sand dunes, that was all around. And that's why we had some cows and some sheep, but we couldn't grow anything because we were too close to the sea, and there was too much salt in the ground, stuff like that. And where the hell did that come from, So that's a long answer to your question, but it's an experience that I think of often.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it there's a certain kind of dream narrative that just doesn't make any sense. Nothing really follows on from it, from the next thing, you're in ancient Rome 1 minute, but then you're in your grandmother's house the next minute, and somehow there's no kind of questioning as to how you got from one place to the next. But with something like this, when you have these coherent, consistent stories playing themselves out in your mind's eye that have total internal logic and make perfect sense within what we know of history and geography and everything, there's something weird going on there. I've never had a past life experience that I can particularly recall. I know my dad has had a moment of kind of experiencing being a warrior killed in a battle, which would probably be I would imagine, if one was to recall something, that would be a particularly traumatic and significant event that would come up.
Yes, this is actually very important. It's about some of this is about dramatic incidents. What I described in the past life regression was mostly quite mundane. Important events like a daughter being born and my death at home, but the rest of it being actually quite mundane. But there's definitely something about dramatic events and that being more likely to resonate through time. And I remember being absolutely fascinated. I had a friend at school when I was a teenager, and he had a birthmark covering half of his face. And years later, I read about theories around that and about trauma on the physical body manifesting itself, echoing itself in marks like that. People who'd been stabbed, having this mark on them where the knife would have been in the past. People being shot had this mark on them. There was something about it that was carried forward, because maybe viewers here can come forward and just say, oh, well, actually, no, birthmarks are the following. But there was a definite resonance there. And I've spoken to people with birthmarks who have related memories or some kind of resonance of an experience that they had that was related to it, because obviously they're in a way they're scarred by it, especially if it's visible, if they're dressed, if it's on their hands or their face, it affects their life in a way. It's like a scar. And they've said, people I've spoken to, they can't really necessarily articulate it very clearly, but they have a feeling that there's some significance about this mark on their body. It isn't just some kind of random thing, because what would explain it really? There's something about it that has some kind of that resonance through time.
I think there was a study that was conducted in India, which was one of those kind of scientific papers that gets published and seems to be vetted as being pretty much flawless in terms of its research, but gets completely ignored because its findings uh, uh, don't support the philosophical worldview that's become predominant in the funded scientific institutions. But the study was of reported past life memories.
Yes, I know this.
You know this one, yeah. So and it was specifically related to birthmarks, because there was a lot of these young children who had maybe a mark here or a mark there, and they would say, "Ah, yes, I got this, I got this when I died, of a car crash or something, and a shard of glass went through me here," and there'd be a mark there. And then they would, if they gave any specific details regarding the location, they would look into the recent history of that sort of nearby villages. It happened in that village over there, and a few years before, what do you know, there was in fact someone died in exactly the same manner as described, with uh, injuries that were then echoed in the birthmarks of the children who are reporting having these past life memories. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, I find the evidence very difficult to dismiss or refute when you have, especially really young children who are not apt to lie. Basically, lying is something that I think we learn later in life. But children are very much will just say what they see. They just tell the truth. They don't understand the manipulation and the sort of coercion of human interactions, that how they can be. So they just tend to say, like you say to a child, "What age are you?" "I'm 6." Or what's your favorite book? What's your favorite toy? What do you like for dinner? They just say that's just to come out with it. It's only later in life that we start to, the cogs in our heads start to whirl, and we start thinking, what's this person asking me this for? What should I say? Should I just say what I think, or do I need to say something else given the situation? Now, I think the book is just here, actually. I can't actually find it. It is on the shelf just behind me, but in any event, it's about reincarnation. The book is called Life Before Life. And it's a well-known book in this field of research. So if people are interested in the stories of particularly young people who are telling stories about what they have done in previous lives that's verifiable, and there's no way they could know otherwise, then it's a very interesting book. And when people outwardly dismiss that, I don't quite understand it, because if some child, 7, 8, 9 years old, tells you that, and why would they do this? And where would the motivation come from? Because I said before about kids and honesty. When they just say, so they live in England, and they say, I lived in Scotland, and I did this, and I did this, and this happened, and this happened. And they've never even been to Scotland or whatever. And then someone looks into it and say, well, yeah, actually, there was that person at that time did these things. This child has just told us about historical events, and how do you just write that off?
Yes. When it's historically verifiable, that's the real clincher, I think. There are a lot of people who go, and I know one character in particular who has been very public in talking about sort of a character from the Middle Ages that he says he made contact with in some spiritual manner, and and it's been historically, it's been investigated and concluded that no, that this couldn't have actually happened. And you get a lot of this kind of postmodern hand wringing of like, well, it's still valid in its own way. And I go, no, no, I want the real stuff. There's plenty of real, verifiable material and experience here that is far more interesting than these things. I don't mean to denigrate, anyone's personal trip. If they want to do that, that's fine. But I think it does a disservice to the mystery of reality.
Yeah, it's very easy to take something that appears ironically verifiably false and just use that to debunk the whole field of inquiry,
Exactly. Yeah.
Someone's a fantasist and they've said this, that, and the other thing about their experience or reality, and it's provably bullshit. So therefore other people with experience along the lines that we've discussed, that has to be written off as well, apparently. For some reason.
Yeah. It's the dominant paradigm of the mechanized civilization is that reductive paradigm, and as we head further into the decline of that mechanized civilization, it seems that people are increasingly starting to question that worldview. In fact, in academia, there's been a massive jumping ship from reductive materialism to panpsychism, which is basically sort of, you go from Daniel Dennett, nothing is conscious, to panpsychist, everything is conscious, because basically if nothing is conscious, then probably everything is conscious anyway. So, the absurdity of that extreme materialism kind of, it eats itself in the end.
Yeah, I think that in general, you can apply this to everything that we've talked about, and particularly the situation we find ourselves in now as a species, that this emerging picture of consciousness as fundamental. And this is the one insight I think that I've had in my lifetime that has changed my life and affected everything that, consciousness being fundamental. Time and space are not fundamental, and all things being conscious, that makes it, that changes everything, including this hell ride that we're going through at the minute with this pandemic bullshit. It gives you a wider perspective in which to view these things. And many of the people that you've spoken to in your interviews, and myself as well, are of this worldview as well. And it really does change everything. And it can seem, I suppose, a little bit remote at first glance. Okay, well, we're going through this stuff day to day. At the minute, it's hard for many people. There are many challenges. This idea of like consciousness being the basis of reality. Well, yeah, but how does that really relate to my day-to-day experience? But if you can integrate that understanding, it does change everything. And it can sound a bit religious as well. It can sound a bit like, oh, there is an afterlife, there is heaven, there is a God, and even though there's no evidence for that apparently in your five senses, trust me, it's there. But I would point, and I've done this many times, I would point viewers to the work of Bernardo Kastrup, again, one of my regular guests. I think he's been one of the most articulate exponents of a scientifically based explanation of consciousness being fundamental and what that actually means. No woo-woo shit at all. Just know this, consider this, and it, more than any other explanation of reality, this makes sense of what we experience, So, and done in scientific terms. So all these people say, trust the science, I fucking love science and everything else. And all this consciousness stuff, is all bullshit. No, read his material, and he's got many books that set his thesis out from many different angles, and I recommend it and will never stop recommending it. I think it's particularly for people who do have a materialist view of the world, and do value science, and why not? Science has been a very useful tool for us. His material is just a really insightful way to interpret what's actually going on here, and that bigger picture that he articulates, for me anyway, on my good days, it changes everything.
This is something that I find really interesting about the work of Anthony Peake as well, is his ability to draw in scientific material from such a wide range of disciplines, and weave it together in this in the model, the cheating the ferryman model. Have you had yourself any experiences that are more in line with that model, that is kind of tangential but not necessarily opposed to the reincarnation model?
Do you mean like sort of metaphysical, or experiences of the paranormal, supernatural, that type of thing?
I suppose sort of experiences of deja vu, precognition, that sort of.
I was just about to say, you've read my mind.
Right.
Deja vu is probably the most common. It's the experience that I've had regularly throughout my life. I think that other experiences of, they happen to people in either moments of crisis or people who need to have that experience. I think they're like teaching experiences, if you see what I mean. So a lot of people who've had, I guess this is another thing that I've documented extensively in interviews over the years, a lot of people who've had experiences of paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, abduction experiences, all these sorts of things. They've been learning experiences. They've been ways of saying reality isn't what you think it is. Consider this. They've been, whether it's been in moments of crisis or not, they've been ways of saying, look again. Consider something different. And I think they do happen to people as they need to happen. So, but for me personally, it's been mostly just about deja vu, which I'm constantly, but not often, caught short by. It'll just be like literally one of those things, like, whoa, I've done this before. I've met this person before. I've been here before. And yeah, I don't know what that is really, but one of the best interviews that I've ever done, and I've not been able to get in contact with the guy again. His website's down. He appears to have dropped off the radar. But his name is, get this, his book is called Synchronicity, and his name is Kirby Surprise. That's the guy's name, Mr. Surprise. And I did a great interview with him. It was hardly an interview at all. He just talked. I was kind of like, okay, I'll just sit back and let you say what you've got to say. But in terms of deja vu, and let's consider synchronicity as being on the same spectrum as that. For people who want a grounded background in synchronicity, look up Carl Jung's work on that, because that is his term really, and the whole episode with his client as a psychotherapist, and the beetle is a kind of archetypal story about synchronicity. But yeah, my interview with Kirby was astounding, and basically what I took away from it, and as I say, you can apply this to deja vu as well, and some of these other anomalous experiences, is that the more you open yourself up to them, the more you look, the more you see. Okay, so once you start to take synchronicity, once you start to read about it, think about it, the more it starts to happen in your life. And that's really, really interesting to me.
This synchronicity, as Jung explained it, has such a powerful resonance, because it's he says it's the eruption of archetypal material into the material world. So that when, or in fact, into the psychic and the material world at the same time. And my experience of synchronicity has been, in fact, it has clustered around crisis events in my life. Interesting. And it appears to cluster around certain other um, events of that type as well. I'm writing a piece at the moment on suicide, and how there's an aspect of it is the synchronicities surrounding my brother's suicide of 10 years ago now, and how the similarities of date, of place, of compounded connections with other suicides as well, that kind of all cluster together, including there's significant parallels between myself and Jasun Horsley and his experience with the sort of suicide by life event of his brother Sebastian in 2010, just about a year before my brother's. So it does seem to indicate when a synchronicity arises, my friend William put it brilliantly, you feel as though you're a character in a fictional narrative, and that somehow that some layer of reality is stripped away, and suddenly you feel as though you're playing out some kind of archetypal destiny that's much bigger than the little mundane box that you typically put yourself in.
Yeah. One of the biggest events in my life, the most significant events, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but a friend who was like a brother to me, really, because we're so similar. We didn't look anything like each other, but beyond that, people would have mistaken us for brothers. And it was like there's nothing I didn't agree with him on. And he committed suicide in 2006, and no one saw it coming. Well, after the event, I started to realize that I saw signs of some kind of psychological disintegration, but I just didn't integrate it at the time. I just let it go, for whatever reason. But I kind of saw, I think that people's lives, the material lives and their environments reflects their inner state. You have the Hermetic dictum, as above, so below. I think in human life terms, as within, so without. So this is going to sound tragically comical, but I remember one of the last times I visited at home before he died, going to get make a cup of tea and going to get some milk from the fridge, and just thinking, Jesus, your fridge is a fucking mess. When's the last time you cleaned this fridge? You got out of date food in here, And the guest room that I used to stay in when I visited him, the last time I was there, he told me, "Oh, look, can you sleep on the sofa?" Because the room's like a bit of a mess. And I looked in it, and you could barely get inside this second bedroom. It's just full of crap. And latterly, I've come to think those were signs of psychological disorder, and there were things about him that I dismissed at the time that, again, I've come to think, there was something there, but you didn't want to see it. And then he was dead. It was too late. But I don't think there's anything any of us could have done about it. So I don't really know why I'm relating that story, but you mentioned suicide, and there's we could do another hour on just suicide, on why people check out of this reality. you know, and sometimes for really simplistic reasons, if something terrible happens, whatever, and they just can't face going on. But I think there's all sorts of very interesting metaphysical and esoteric dimensions to terminating your own life on this plane.
Yes. It's interesting to hear you make that parallel with your own experience, because as you mentioned, it was, in my brother's case, very, very unexpected to everyone. But if you looked closely, there were particular signs, and he underwent a very rapid kind of psychic disintegration. Yes, I think that there are so many reasons why people do these things. It seems to be particularly a disease of the modern world, and a disease of a certain kind of affluent society that has a collapse of meaning. And yeah, but the as you say, I suspect there are a lot of deeper esoteric dimensions to it.
Have you, this is like a really brutal personal question, and I've got zero reason. I mean, we only connected relatively recently, and I was aware of your work because Jason, Jasun Horsley, you've interviewed, and he posted your links to your material online. But to any extent whatsoever, have you ever thought about that you would be better off dead than alive?
In my life, a lot. Yeah, it was always me that was the suicide concern of the family. It was kind of funny to look back and actually sort of chuckle about that. But yeah, I was very much the depressed sort of goth. Well, we both went through our depressive goth phase, but I was very much, I lent into that a lot more. Was really quite, I at the age of about 15, I became obsessed with the film Donnie Darko, and kind of thought I was caught up. If people haven't seen the film, it's basically about a young man, teenage boy actually, that finds himself in a sort of a parallel universe that shouldn't be, and then that's essentially what the film is about. But that was my belief. So I kind of held on to that narrative, which kind of kept me going at the same time, also making me basically kind of suicidal. So between the ages of sort of 15 and 20, probably not a day went by when I didn't think about it at some point, about terminating the whole thing. And then from the age of 20 onwards, it tailed off. And I've since, it's a really interesting question that you raise, actually, because since sort of my early 20s and a couple of sort of spiritual experiences that I now regard as a bit suspect because they came under the influence of psychedelics, which I'm a little bit wary of these days. But I do think also there was some truth to them. And then after that, fairly quickly after that, about 6 months, the death of my brother. Since then, it's never really occurred to me that being dead would be better than being alive, because being dead wouldn't end the things that I'm trying to get away from. So it wouldn't make any sense to commit suicide, because I would have to face those things, and possibly in a more confused state, which is a sense that I have had, in fact, in a sense of not communication, I would say, but a kind of sense of where my brother could be and what he could be experiencing is a sort of a mix of healing bliss, but also real confusion, and having to face a lot of these things. And I think it's better to face them when we're alive in this body. So these days, in even in the midst of my regularly scheduled nervous breakdowns, I'm pretty much happier being alive.
I spent time in New Zealand just prior to the onset of the pandemic, and there's a lot of talk about globalists and other people with the means to do so. We're going to New Zealand, we're going to buy a farm in New Zealand. What I learned, so what the insight I've had since then, there's nowhere to run.
Yeah.
And I would map that over into the metaphysical dimension, that snuffing out the life in your physical body, you don't escape from anything. You just arrive in a different place. There's just a change of your cosmic address. So if you're trying to escape from something, you can't. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. There's nowhere to run.
Our leaders have been warned. A nice sort of cycle back from the global to the personal and back to the global. I think it'd be a good place to wrap things up. I would really like to talk to you further. Particularly, it seems like there's a kind of a follow-on maybe on the subject of suicide. Would be really interesting to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's certainly something we can do. In the meantime, it's been a pleasure talking with you for the first time, and I really like all the interviews, most of which that you've conducted that I've listened to, and you're really adding something to the information universe. So I thank you for that, and thanks so much for asking me to talk with you today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being here, and it's great to hear you say that as my favorite podcaster right now, extending those compliments. Very much appreciated. Greg, for those who are looking for your work online, where can we find it?
So simply legalisefreedom.com. That's legalise-freedom.com. You can spell legalise with an S or a Z. I bought both domains to anticipate the different spellings around the world. There's a YouTube channel, a Twitter account, a Facebook page, all of that stuff. But if you put legalisefreedom.com into your favorite search engine, you'll find it. And you've got currently 340 plus interviews and a bucket load of YouTube videos and articles as well. So please, if you've been interested in any of the topics that we've spoken about, have a visit, have an explore, and hopefully you'll find something to engage you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Greg, and talk to you again soon.
My pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.